The bright studio lights of a nationally televised morning show illuminated every corner of the set. Cameras moved silently across the floor as producers counted down the final seconds. Before going live, Dwayne Johnson sat comfortably in his chair, dressed in a dark blue suit and wearing his usual confident smile. Across from him sat veteran host George Stephanopoulos, reviewing a stack of notes while crew members made last-minute adjustments. The interview had originally been planned as a relaxed conversation about Dwayne's latest movie, his charitable projects, and his busy schedule. Everyone expected an entertaining segment filled with laughs and inspirational stories. At first, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The opening minutes were warm and friendly. George welcomed viewers and introduced Dwayne to enthusiastic applause from the studio audience. Dwayne greeted everyone with his trademark energy. He spoke about his latest film, shared funny stories from the set, and joked about his intense workout routines. The audience laughed. The crew relaxed. Everything seemed perfect. But as the interview continued, the atmosphere slowly began to change. George shifted the discussion toward criticism Dwayne had recently received online. At first, Dwayne answered calmly. He explained that public life always comes with scrutiny. He said people are entitled to their opinions. The conversation remained respectful. Then George brought up another controversial topic. This time, the question was more direct. The audience immediately sensed the change in tone. Dwayne paused for a moment before answering. His smile faded slightly. He responded carefully, choosing his words with precision. George listened, but followed up with another challenging question. And then another. The discussion was no longer about movies or motivation. It had become increasingly personal. Backstage, producers exchanged nervous glances. One producer quietly whispered into a headset, "Keep an eye on this." Dwayne remained composed. Years of media experience had taught him how to handle difficult interviews. But viewers could see that his patience was being tested. George continued pressing for more detailed answers. The host wasn't being hostile, but he was persistent. Every response seemed to generate another question. The tension slowly increased. The audience grew quieter. At one point, Dwayne leaned forward in his chair. His voice remained calm, but the warmth had disappeared. "I think I've answered that already." George nodded. "I understand, but many people still want clarification." A few audience members shifted uncomfortably. The exchange was becoming noticeably intense. Dwayne took a deep breath. For a moment, it looked as if he was deciding how much more he wanted to say. The cameras captured every expression, every pause, every reaction. Millions of viewers watched from home. George asked another question related to the same subject. This time, Dwayne didn't answer immediately. Several seconds passed. The silence felt unusually long for live television. When he finally spoke, his tone was firmer. "I came here today to talk about my work, my projects, and the things that matter to me." George maintained eye contact. And many viewers would argue that accountability matters too. The studio suddenly felt much smaller. The audience sat perfectly still. Even crew members stopped moving. Dwayne crossed his arms. For the first time, frustration was visible on his face. The interview had reached a crossroads. One path led back to lighter topics. The other led deeper into confrontation. Neither man appeared willing to back away. George continued. Dwayne responded. The exchange became sharper. Not angry, not shouting, but unmistakably tense. Then something unexpected happened. A microphone problem briefly interrupted the broadcast. The audio crackled for several seconds. The technical issue forced producers to cut to a short commercial break, earlier than planned. As soon as the cameras stopped broadcasting, the atmosphere changed dramatically. Crew members rushed onto the set. Technicians checked equipment. Producers hurried between stations. The tension that had been building suddenly had somewhere to go. Dwayne stood up from his chair and walked toward the side of the set. George remained seated, reviewing his notes. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The silence seemed louder than the interview itself. One senior producer approached Dwayne. "We still have several minutes left after the break." Dwayne nodded. The producer hesitated. "How would you like to proceed?" Dwayne looked toward the audience, then toward the cameras, then toward George. He thought carefully before answering. "I'll finish the interview." The producer looked relieved. When the commercial break ended, both men returned to their seats. Viewers immediately noticed something different. The energy had changed, not because the tension was gone, but because both men seemed determined to handle it differently. George spoke first. "I want to acknowledge that some of these questions have been difficult." Dwayne nodded. "And I understand why you're asking them." The audience listened closely. For the first time since the tension began, the conversation slowed down. Instead of trying to win the exchange, both men focused on understanding each other's perspective. George explained why journalists ask challenging questions. Dwayne explained what it feels like to live under constant public scrutiny. The discussion became thoughtful rather than confrontational. Viewers who had expected a dramatic argument found themselves watching something more meaningful. Two experienced professionals were navigating disagreement in real time. Neither side fully surrendered their position. Neither side completely agreed. But they began listening. As the interview approached its conclusion, the atmosphere softened. Dwayne shared a story from early in his career, a story about criticism, mistakes, and personal growth. The audience responded warmly. George thanked him for being willing to discuss difficult topics. Dwayne thanked George for giving him the opportunity to explain his perspective. The applause that followed felt genuine, not because everyone agreed, but because they had witnessed something rare, a tense moment that didn't spiral into chaos, a disagreement that didn't become hostility. When the broadcast finally ended, crew members exhaled with relief. Producers congratulated the team. The audience slowly filed out of the studio. Online reactions began pouring in almost immediately. Some viewers believed George had asked important questions. Others felt Dwayne had been unfairly challenged. Debates spread across social media throughout the day, but one clip stood out above all the others. It wasn't the tense moments. It wasn't the disagreement. It was the moment after the commercial break when both men chose to continue the conversation rather than walk away. That clip quickly became the most shared segment from the interview. Hours later, as the studio lights dimmed and the set grew quiet, staff members were still discussing what had happened. Not because it had been a disaster, not because anyone had won, but because live television is unpredictable. Sometimes the most memorable moments aren't the ones filled with applause and laughter. Sometimes they're the moments when strong personalities face disagreement, emotion, and pressure, and still find a way to finish the conversation. And long after the cameras stopped rolling, that was the part people remembered most.